My name is Teresa Harris, and I'm with the AAAS Scientific Responsibility Human Rights and Law Program, which serves as the Secretariat of the Science and Human Rights Coalition. One of the member organizations of the coalition is the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPSSY for short. And we're always happy to highlight the work that SPSSY and of course, other member organizations are doing for human rights. SPSSY recently submitted a statement to the United Nations that calls for the UN to integrate the elimination of systemic racism and racial and ethnic discrimination into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as they're usually called. They're going to talk about that statement, explain to you. They have a short presentation. I'm grateful that we have leaders of that initiative today with us to tell us more about it, and they'll introduce themselves. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to go over a few ground rules for today's session, how this is going to work differently from the plenary sessions. We have about 90 minutes for the session today. The speakers, as I said, they're going to introduce themselves and share a brief presentation explaining this initiative. After that, we'll open the floor to questions. So please type your questions in the chat box, and when we get to them, we'll call on you to ask the question, unmute your microphone, and ask the question. That'll help us get through as many questions as we can in the time we have, and it'll also help us avoid having people talking at once. So, please, unless you are asking a question, we've called on you, please keep your mic on mute to avoid disrupting others. But please do use the chat to ask questions, mention things that really strike you, anything like that in the chat. So thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. And now I'll pass the microphones over to Corann and David to begin the conversation.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry, thank you, Teresa. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for having us this afternoon. We want to tell you about a written statement that we've recently submitted to the United Nations. And the process behind it and the content of it. And I hope this gives you an indication, a taste of how one can advocate for policy and good science within the context of the United Nations. I'm David Levert. I'm the SPSSY's main representative to the United Nations, and I'm relatively new to the team. And my colleague, Corann Okorodudu, is another representative to the United Nations. Corann's also one of the founding presidents of the Psychology Coalition of NGOs at the United Nations. And she's a very wise member of our team, and she's going to tell you more about the detail of the statement. So what we'd like to do is to offer a little educational activity here. Many of you are familiar with the UN, and many of you are familiar with advocacy at the UN. But in case you are not, we have a short presentation for you. So we're calling this Holding a Mirror Up to Sustainability, Eliminating Racism Through Pursuing the SDGs. Let's see if we can make this go. All right, so let's give you a brief overview of the UN. And this is photographically a brief overview of the UN. As you may know, the UN is celebrating its 75th anniversary. It currently has 193 member states, in addition to other observer status entities. The powers of the Charter enable the United Nations to engage in all kinds of issues of relevance to the world, not just security, not just conflict, but climate change, human trafficking, human rights, food production, and others. You may or may not be familiar with the three major constituencies involved in the United Nations. Well, first, there are the member nations themselves, the 193 states, many of whom have consulates in New York, and everyone attends the General Assembly meetings. There is the United Nations staff and agencies That's the towering building you see, the Secretariat. The General Assembly building is the curvy building in front of you. And there's also UN entities in Europe, in Geneva and The Hague. But the third group we want to focus in on for now, and that is the NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are part of the United Nations civil society and that are accredited to take actions at the United Nations. You're probably familiar with the Security Council and the General Assembly we just spoke of. There's the Court of Justice and the Secretariat. But let's look at the Economic and Social Council. This entity is specifically designed to interface with NGOs and civil society in pursuit of myriad issues. Among these, social development, the status of women, population and development, the SDGs that we'll talk about shortly, issues regarding indigenous peoples, and so on and so on. Scientists and attendees at this conference may be interested to know that there is a statistical commission as well that you can follow. So ECOSOC is where these kinds of things are happening. Now, what I want to do is to talk about our organization, SPICY, which has held an NGO, which has held accreditation at the United Nations since the 1990s. So here we go. As SPICY, as Teresa told you, was founded in 1936. We've just had a recent anniversary, and explicitly to apply science and good evidence to social policy and social issues. And a number of prominent social psychologists and others were involved in its founding and its leadership over the last 80 years. We used to say we were the 3 Ps, peace, prejudice, and poverty, but this is expanded to environment, to justice, to migration, to all kinds of issues. Over 2,000 psychologists are members of SPICY worldwide. We are very active in social policy, and Sarah Mancall, who is on our conference right now, who's waving, can tell you all about the activities that SPICY does locally in Washington, on the Hill, and other policy initiatives. Also, since we are in the days of COVID, there are a lot of webinars also available. So our challenge on the United Nations team is to educate civil society at the UN and member nations and the UN staff regarding psychological approaches to social issues and how evidence can be used, and to advocate and to write statements and for both the member states and UN staff and other NGOs that are part of civil society at the UN. Our purpose is twofold, though. We are also tasked with disseminating what's going on at the UN to our members, our psychologists, to get them up to speed and to show them ways that they can align their research with global priorities and to personally engage. We'd like to note that we had an article in our flagship journal, the Journal of Social Issues, actually noting the founding of the UN. And there were a number of SPICY scientists who were involved in the first few years in work around prejudice and conflict reduction, as you might not be surprised, in the late 40s and early 50s. So that's an introduction to SPICY. I'd like to switch back to the UN and talk about Sustainable Development Goals. Well, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I know many of you are already familiar with SDGs. And in fact, I believe there's a parallel event going on right now at this conference regarding SDGs. They're becoming more and more widespread and disseminated. There were originally Millennial Development Goals promulgated in the year 2000 with a target year of 2015. There were less Millennial Development Goals, and in 2013 and 14 and 15, there were meetings and work among the member states to create a new set of goals. There are more content areas addressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. There are more of them. And I believe there's more precision in terms of how they've been articulated. But let's drop down into them. So here we have them, just a brief, colorful overview. Issues such as poverty, hunger, renewable energy, peace and justice, life on land. Now, can you, when you think about these goals, in some ways they are overlapping. There is a relationship between quality education and gender equality. We know there's a relationship between health and hunger. So it's not as to say that these are necessarily separate issues, but to engage them, one does have to separate them and articulate them, operationalize them. I just want to give you a quick example. Good health and well-being as an SDG of interest. Some of the goals for good health and well-being concern infant mortality, maternal mortality, epidemics, substance use, and traffic accidents. But we'd like to also note these 6 or 7 words at the end of this sentence. By 2030, reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment, and promote mental health and well-being. Well, it turns out, and Corann can give us the history of this, that this concern with mental health was the result of psychologists getting together at the United Nations in various NGOs to petition to include wording about mental health in our SDG for health and well-being. It took a lot of work, but finally these few words were included, and this is considered a major achievement in terms of putting psychology on the agenda for the world. Here are some others. I'd note that under all of these goals, then there are specific targets. And I don't know if you can see this, but so this is the target for maternal mortality, and there's a ratio, and there's a proportion of births attended by mental health personnel. For the target of infant mortality, there's an under 5 mortality rate, a neonatal mortality rate, and I think I have one more page of this. Epidemics, there's various incidents of tuberculosis and malaria as targets, and cardiovascular disease mortality rate is under target 3-4. The reason it will become very clear very shortly why I'm focusing on this, because these look like, probably at first glance, very, very reasonable and precise approaches to these goals. Every year since 2015, during the summer at the high-level political forum, nations can participate in a 2-week-long conference to basically see where we are and how we're doing on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As part of this conference, nations may submit what are known as voluntary national reports to highlight how they are doing on either selected SDGs or all of them. If you notice the one in the middle, Korea is responding to 6 SDGs that were the targets this year. Nations such as France will address all the SDGs in their reports. But basically, this is how nations report out. They disseminate the national reports. They're attending the high-level political forum, and there's a lot of discussion of how best to measure best practices in terms of intervention and basically experiences on the ground. This is where, now setting the context, Corann will share the content of our recent statement.
The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, launched 5 years ago by the General Assembly, promised that the agenda would fulfill human rights to equality, and non-discrimination across the 17 goals, leaving no one behind. In September, a month ago, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues developed and distributed a statement with recommendations at the United Nations endorsed by close to 100 non-governmental and civil society organizations, questioning whether this laudatory objective of leaving no one behind will be achieved by 2030. The statement provides evidence from content analyses of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals framework that although the introduction to the SDGs is visionary in its stated commitment to protect and fulfill human rights for all, and to end racial, gender, and other forms of discrimination prohibited by international law, the goals, targets, and global indicators developed to evaluate progress on the attainment of the SDGs fail to reflect an equally robust focus on this important human rights commitment. In this presentation, I will focus on the three elements of the statement. The statement begins with a brief discussion that systemic racism and racial and ethnic discrimination as human rights violations constitute global barriers to optimal human development of targeted groups. Despite some advances due to decades of anti-racism struggle, systemic racism, racial, ethnic, and related forms of discrimination continue as sources of marginalization, exclusion, inequality, and oppression among people in all regions of the world. Racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in all their insidious and intersecting forms are human rights violations transmitted across generations and structurally rooted in the values, beliefs, institutional and national norms and practices, and reflected in everyday behavior of individuals and groups in every society. These human rights violations serve simultaneously to rationalize the hierarchical domination by a racial or ethnic group over other groups, and to maintain psychological, social, political, and material advantages for the dominant group while producing cumulative adverse outcomes for oppressed and excluded groups. The continuing police murders of unarmed African American men, women, and youth in the United States provides a powerful illustration of racial oppression that results from and strengthens the persistence of systemic racism across generations and centuries if it is not eradicated. The killing of George Floyd, an African American, on the 25th of May, while he was in the custody of police in Minneapolis, Minnesota, led to the largest, most ethnically diverse civil protest across the US against systemic racism since the 1960s. Due to the instantaneous outreach of social media images, the US protests featuring Black Lives Matter and other advocacy groups became a massive global protest movement. Ethnically diverse crowds in the thousands marched both in solidarity with and protests with the protests in the US and against racism in their own countries. Systemic racism is associated with disparities in many areas of human development, including access to quality education, employment for living wages, justice, physical and mental health, and social security, access to basic needs like food, safe drinking water, and housing, access to political participation, equal protection against the ravages of climate disasters and political participation, protection against racial profiling and police violence. Next, the statement presents data that show that systemic racism, racial and ethnic discrimination are peripheral to other aspects of inequality in the Sustainable Development Goals, such as sex, age, and disability. To assess these discrepancies, we did a content analysis of the Sustainable Development Goals framework by comparing the frequency of various identity-based words and phrases. For each of the identity words or phrases, we counted the total number of times the word or phrase appears in a Sustainable Development document, especially in the introductory section and the listing of the 17 goals and 169 targets or sub-goals. We found that sex-related terms, for example, woman, girl, are the most frequent identity terms, appearing a total of 68 times, and age-related terms, for example, child, youth, appear 42 times. In contrast, racial identity terms, race, indigenous, ethnicity, occur 14 times, 7 times in the goals and targets section. The scarcity of racial identity terms across the 17 goals and 169 targets ignores the real-life intersectional processes by which each of the goals and their targets may be influenced by racism, race, ethnicity, and related factors. What's equally important is that in 2017, researchers at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University and the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law reported that inequalities based on race, ethnicity, and similar factors do not receive the same attention as gender equality in the SDGs, their targets, and the global indicators or metrics approved by the UN General Assembly to monitor progress on implementing the SDGs. While we support the strength of the gender focus in the SDGs, the author's analysis of the SDG global indicators is deeply troubling with respect to the exclusion of many marginalized groups. Although the call for disaggregated data by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, etc., appears at the top of the initial list of the 2030 indicators, the researchers found that the list did not include a single indicator specifically requiring disaggregation by race or ethnicity, even in SDG 10, which focuses on reducing inequalities. Our analysis of the most recent update of the Global Indicators Framework in 2020 shows a slight increase in the inclusion of race and ethnicity from 0 to 5 indicators, with only 2 of the 169 targets and a minimum of 5 out of 231 current global indicators requiring disaggregated data on race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity are likely to continue to be sidelined in the monitoring of the SDGs, resulting in the absence of useful information that could be available to member states and other stakeholders for reducing systemic racism and racial inequalities. A recent assessment in Australia of progress on the SDGs using disaggregated data, found that the indigenous population in that country lags significantly behind the national average for 11 out of 12 indicators reviewed, clearly demonstrating the significance of disaggregated data on race and ethnicity in identifying progress needed in sustainable development. So it's in spite of the 75 years of the UN's anti-racism engagement, racism and racial ethnic discrimination persists today as pervasive and destructive national and global forces, even in the SDGs. Following the brutal murder of George Floyd, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, reminded us that the persistent plague of racism is a scourge that violates the UN Charter and debases our core values. He called for dismantling racist structures and reforming racist institutions, as well as a one-year debate on racism within the United Nations organization as interventions that are central to the 2030 agenda. Subsequently, a group of more than 20 senior UN executives of African descent, including the executive director of WHO, published a strongly worded editorial in which they expressed outrage at the pervasiveness of systemic racism and stressed the importance of going beyond words to deeds. SPECI strongly supports this call, which is consistent with the recent assertion of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent that the eradication of structural racism is key to the attainment of the SDGs, as well as the advice of Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, High Commissioner for Human Rights during the intergovernmental negotiations on the SDGs in 2015, that without the inclusion of marginalized groups and minorities in the 2030 SDG agenda, the goal of leaving no one behind would not succeed. And I will end here so that David can present the recommendations in the statement.
Thank you, Corann. The statement contains 10 recommendations based on our findings. And am I still sharing my screen, folks?
Yes.
Great. So let me go through them briefly. First of all, develop laws, policies, and programs to mitigate systemic racism and reduce ethnic discrimination relevant to each SDG. Then, several recommendations having to do with data and disaggregation. SDG progress needs to employ indicators that are disaggregated by race, ethnicity, descent, national origin, and many other categories that may represent minority statuses in particular national contexts. If you recall, we were looking at the outcomes for health, and we looked at maternal mortality and neonatal mortality. And as an example, that those data should be broken out in national reports and reporting to the UN by relevant groups. The UN Statistical Commission can invest and increase with the goal of increasing the availability of data and instructing and assisting nations that need the help and disaggregating and being sure that everyone's represented in the SDG data. So there is an issue of capacity building as well. And this, of course, is addressed by SDG 17, that is to form and facilitate the establishment of partnerships towards these goals. Often, we see developed countries, such as Germany, in their voluntary national reviews, talk about their achievements domestically, but then a large part of what they are presenting has to do with ways in which they've helped build a capacity in other nations to also pursue the SDG agenda. Include in the voluntary national reviews data regarding the compliance with human rights standards as spelled out in other conventions on human rights. These should be part and parcel of that national review. Speed up contributions of resources to the International Decade for People of African Descent. Ratify and implement the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Not all member states have done so. And for those of you who don't know and are interested in progress on all of these conventions on human rights, you can go to the UN website and you can actually click through a map of the world to see who's ratified various conventions, to see which nations have signed on and which nations have not touched them. So it can be very instructive. Member nations should integrate the Durban Declaration into all of their work on SDGs. We also should, in the SDGs, not only pursue disaggregated data, but also to recognize intersectionality and intersecting forms of group oppression. So for example, if data are reported out by women and men, they should also be reported out potentially by race and ethnicity or indigenous status or so on. Reporting out these intersecting groups provides a much deeper insight into remaining racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. It benefits all. Finally, look for ways to involve the private sector and NGOs in collaboration around eliminating systematic racism in the SDGs, and part of that is simply to add to the conversation. So as we've, there are 4,000 NGOs that are accredited in New York at the United Nations, and most of them are talking at some point every year about SDGs. And so we are encouraging that those conversations and all the good efforts to attain these SDGs embed a discussion of systematic racism and discrimination in their work. These are the 10 recommendations that we made. And so thank you for your patience in letting us present to you on the UN and on our statement. I think it'd be a great time to take some questions or comments. So, back to you, Therese.
Thank you. And so sorry to everybody, and especially to Corann about the problem with the mute, but I'm glad we resolved that. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and then we can call on you, unmute your mic to so that you can ask the question. First, I'll get this started, I think. So thank you for the very thorough explanation of the issues and the approach, why it's important to include this in the SDGs. Have you received any feedback yet from the staff who work on the SDGs or from member nations? Has there been any response?
Not from member organizations, nor have we received yet from the UN, except in our follow-up to make sure that the UN top officials have received the communication that we sent. We heard from the Secretary General that the communication was received, but I have yet to hear from the others. The most support we have gotten have been from non-governmental organizations. The endorsers have been very welcoming of the statement, and they have encouraged us to move forward with a campaign that to get some action from this statement, we will need to bring together non-governmental organizations that are passionate about this, and perhaps some member states to really get concrete movement on the recommendations, especially the most crucial being the disaggregation of data.
Can you give us a sense of the types of NGOs, organizations that endorse the statement or that are looking into that kind of a campaign?
Oh, they're just a variety. I just recognized a few of the ones that are operating out of the New York area, but they were not confined to the New York area because of, we were able to get it transmitted globally. So some of them are coming in from Africa, from Asia, Latin America. So it was pretty global.
Other questions from the audience? We have a great group of people here. I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. This is a really exciting initiative. Maybe I'll ask Sarah if I can pick on you or invite you to the conversation. I'd invite you to talk a little bit more about how this you see this kind of action by members of your organization. How does that connect to the organization overall? Other work that's happening that SPCY is doing around human rights issues?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm SPCY's policy director here in Washington, and I work primarily on federal policy, but I also kind of have a hand in every pot. And I think social justice is kind of foundational to who we are as a scientific society. I mean, we were founded explicitly by psychologists in the 30s who felt that psychological science should have an application to the real world and should be used to improve human well-being. And so we've always seen our policy work as kind of central to our mission and helping our members use their expertise and their research to advance policy work that's informed by the science. So with regard to this particular issue, a lot of our members study prejudice and discrimination and racism. And on top of that, kind of in parallel, we've been doing a lot of work on this issue at the national level. So just to give one example, we worked in partnership with a number of other organizations on submitting a public response to the recent executive branch executive order regarding the teaching of anti-racism in federal or federal contract settings. So there was an executive order that came out on September 22nd, basically in a nutshell saying that many forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-racism, anti-sexism, work being done are problematic in the eyes of the administration, and saying that they have no place. And so the American Educational Research Association, which very well might be in the room right now, because they also do a lot of great human rights work, and the National Academy on Education put together a brief 2-page statement saying, no, actually the science backs us up. We have a lot of great research on the importance of doing high quality diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and anti-racism education matters. And a bunch of scientific societies came together to sign that statement and have issued statements of their own. So we really see this work as central to who we are as a society. We've never seen ourselves as a scientific society that's all about publishing in journals and presenting at academic conferences, although we do that too. Yeah, this is really key to who we are.
Thanks, Sarah. And AERA is also a member of the Science and Human Rights Coalition. So another question that comes to mind. So as you noted, there is another session going on now about the SDGs and the involvement of scientists in that. It seems that with the call for better data, disaggregated data, that perhaps there would be a role for other scientific fields. In your work and in this issue in particular, where are there opportunities for other scientific associations and academic institutions, other groups within the scientific community to bring their voice to this?
Are you speaking to just
to you and to David? Sorry.
Okay. I think because there was a lot of emphasis at the beginning of the negotiations of the Sustainable Development about the importance of data. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was in the forefront of putting human rights principles, offering human rights principles as important guides to the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's interesting that the Statistical Commission put together an expert group to develop these indicators or measures. And everybody was saying that disaggregation was important and central. But if you look at the amount of disaggregated data that has been, as measures that have been suggested, it has been very, very little as compared with the robust concern for disaggregation. Now, race and ethnicity were not included among the 17 goals, even though many of us advocated and we tried to get member states to recommend a goal. But we were able to get human rights language, very strong human rights language in the introduction to the SDGs. But we felt that at least with disaggregated data, and disaggregated data is really called for by many of the human rights standards, that disaggregated data would get close to revealing the importance of race and ethnicity and indigenous status, national origin, disability, all of these identities that are protected by human rights law. That if we only got the disaggregated data to be inclusive of these identities, we would be getting closer to the goal of leaving no one behind. But as it has existed thus far, the danger is that we will get to 2030 and a lot of people will be left behind unless we can get very good disaggregated data.
I would add it's clear that evidence-based approaches have traction and are valued by the United Nations community, but there is a role for scientists and those in civil society for keeping the pressure up on nations, not only to be data-driven in terms of achieving goals, but to be smart, sophisticated about how they're analyzing the data, specifically disaggregation. So yeah, there absolutely is a role for scientists to in this specific human rights initiative.
Especially people who are methodologists, who can suggest or help with the development of disaggregated metrics.
Why in particular methodologists? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, that disaggregated data frequently requires going beyond just group averages or national averages to look at how various subgroups in the population, as these subgroups are intersected by other identities, how they are faring on each of the goals. So among the kinds of people who could offer substantive help would be people who are methodologists, who are familiar with statistical methods that could offer the help in how these methods could be organized to offer more disaggregated data.
Many of the, that pertains to methodology, pertains to coverage, modes of data collection, how data is rolled up internally within a nation, the categories that are employed in terms of self-reports and ascribed statuses. So there are a lot of, there are a lot of entry points in which the quality of the data can be impacted. So that's why we say methodology.
That makes sense. Well, I feel like I'm dominating the questions. Here is a question. Merkel, can you unmute your mic and ask the question?
Sure. So hi, David and Corann. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the process of preparing the statement to be sent to the UN Secretary General and the kind of feedback you received from the other NGOs and other groups that were involved at various stages of getting this to its final destination. Thanks.
Well, I can start with the SPCC team. Most of the work occurred within the SPCC team. And you were involved in that work. There were interns involved and representatives involved in looking into research on disparities, racial disparities across a number of areas of development, and kind of summarizing their findings on these particular topics. And then I was involved with coordinating all of the input, the very good input that you and others of the team, including our esteemed chair, David, in putting together a rough draft and feeding it back into the team for critiques, edits, and so forth. So a lot of the drafting took place within the SPCC team at the UN. And then as our, before we could put it out to get sign-ons by other groups, we had to submit it to SPCC headquarters for review, comment, make suggested changes, and so forth. So that's the process that we usually use in developing statements. We put the first draft together, and then SPCC looks at it, gives their input into the statement, and then we go back into the team, finalize it, and then put it out. As I said, the first few organizations that signed on sent emails indicating that they were very receptive to the statement, and some encouraged us to move forward into a campaign where we would keep the statement open for more endorsements as we begin to try to explore how the statement might lead to some concrete change or changes.
I'm on the chat. I posted a URL to connect to the statement directly on the SPCC website. I should note that constructing a statement like this is not something that you may be used to as a scientist. So you have to not only integrate good evidence regarding your topic, but you also have to integrate where your suggested actions fit within the context of UN documents and conventions. So both have to be inserted. It has to be persuasive. You have to have some recommendations. And all of this within either 2,000 or 1,400 or 1,500 words. Now, that is tough. And so constructing a written statement requires a lot of editing and thinking through and choice of words. I mean, it's a great challenge to be able to translate science into recommendations for global policy. It takes some care and lots of experience.
I see that there's a question from Ollie Moles. Ollie, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, it's perhaps a follow-up to this, and maybe things you have covered a bit already, but I'm interested in next steps and whether and when and how this information may go to the member countries and perhaps also to NGOs that might be working, scientific societies and others within these countries that might help to gain the kind of information that you're looking for.
Well, the statement has been sent to all of the member countries of the United Nations. Some of them have received it more than once because we sent it to the General Assembly, which is open to all the member states. But we haven't received any feedback yet from member states.
We are, in terms of moving forward, one of the places one can start is with the current endorsing organizations. And well, we will set up on the SPCC side as a way for in the future for any organizations also to add to the endorsement. But I think the way we're thinking about this as a next step is to get those who have been very interested in what we're doing to brainstorm a campaign among civil society at the UN. And that may include some outreach to specific missions at the United Nations and also potentially presentations at various commissions and events, single standing events such as international days of commemoration and so on.
Perhaps you're doing this already. I was thinking of counterparts of social science organizations and educational research and so on in other countries, and whether you are working or might plan to work with groups like that.
We certainly can consider that. Our access, the low-hanging fruit are all of the NGOs that are accredited with the UN around the world. And many of those have signed on. But to get a link with it, to go beyond that within the nation is a bit more challenging, but certainly something that we would consider, certainly in psychology, certainly in education.
We have a question about the right to science from Gisa.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. And also a statement or side note, if you will, that in my other hat, when I'm not Treatment Action Group, I'm with Matahari Global Solutions, and we're actually in the process of starting up a project on race and ethnic diversity and global health. So I would love to connect with the speakers after this conference to talk about this. But my question is, if in your analysis beyond the SDGs, have you connected your analysis for the statement to any other parts of the UN human rights framework, such as the right to science or the right to non-discrimination? The general comment that we talked about this morning does provide a little bit of language on race, ethnicity, and non-discrimination.
No, we have our main focus, because of the time constraints. Our main focus has been looking at what the UN has done about racism, and there's a whole history. The UN almost started with racism as an issue, and they began to do racial investigations into racism very shortly after the founding. So we had quite a bit to look at in terms of the documentations of the work that the UN has done, and looking at how we could, what kind of social science, psychological science we could get that would support that work or support our recommendations. What's been happening in the UN otherwise. So that was a very time-consuming work. So that's where our focus has been concentrated.
The SDGs are a common currency. So many written statements, many programming, a lot of programming are framed by the SDGs. So that was the first place to go. And you can also think about how the SDGs are being disseminated in terms of universities, colleges, and schools through sustainability classes and other arenas. This was the primary modality that we wanted to pursue. But obviously there are other routes in which we can also engage them.
David, you said a little earlier that you made the point, a very important point, that the kind of writing for this is different than the way scientists usually write their findings and recommendations. If someone was interested in getting into that kind of advocacy, contributing their own research findings to that kind of advocacy at the United Nations, how would they find out whether their research is useful, connect with people who are doing this kind of advocacy, and learn those skills?
Wow, what a great question. I'm sure Corann and Sarah also have thoughts. First of all, you want to, so the SDGs provide at least a guidance in terms of where your work may connect, whether it has to do with water, fish, solar, what have you. Look at your own professional associations and see who has a presence at the United Nations, see who is accredited or has made presentations or has a policy unit. And if that doesn't suffice, there are a lot of us, there are a lot of NGOs that even though we're called psychology, for example, we have to be able to carry a portfolio of social science. I mean, we have to be prepared when we talk to people in the hallways, and UN staff and missions people about a wide variety of issues around behavioral science. So you may look a little farther afield than your own discipline in terms of connecting with NGOs that are already there.
Thank you. We have a question from Kate Mara. Kate, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Well, I will ask it. David, did you say that these recommendations include anti-racism education efforts that could take place in schools for younger people?
Not to my knowledge, Corann. I don't think.
No, it doesn't include it, but it's a very important aspect. We were focusing on what governments and the UN need to do. And so these actions, now it could be that governments could make funds available to support anti-racism education, both formal and informal. But that's a very good suggestion.
We were motivated by the fact that we have, this is the second generation of goals, well articulated, lots of work to refine measurements and targets. And yet they kind of forgot about some of the primary values and motivations behind the United Nations. So that's one of the goals here, is to connect the two.
And there is an education goal in the Sustainable Development Goals. So if the ideas of integrating the elimination of racism in the education goal, it would go a long way.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question.
Teresa, I have another question, but I'm on my phone and it's taking me so long to type. My apologies. I would just pulled up the recommendations and glancing over them, and it states that you were hoping for the member states to include existing and presumably also new data and indicators in the voluntary national reviews that they are supposed to submit on a regular basis. And I was wondering what your thoughts on the kind of the quality and the state of the voluntary national reviews were. I have heard from other organizations working in the gender and sexuality space that they have been rather disappointed kind of by the quality of the reporting.
Yes, and some follow-up actions that we might take might have to do with looking at the quality of the reports and making recommendations about how the quality of reports could be enhanced. So it would mean organizing sessions at the high-level political forum in July that would deal with these kinds of issues.
I think we're starting to see that in some of the content, as a matter of fact, for the HLPA. Yeah, if you can, anyone can go to the SDG websites and with a little fishing, get to the voluntary national reviews. And you will be struck by the variation from nation to nation in terms of presentation and depth. So, you know, some are good, some could be improved.
But it at least sounds like you have hope for them yet.
I think that having hope is part of the job, essentially.
Fair enough.
Well, I mean, seriously, engaging in the United Nations is a work of, there's faith there that you're going to do something that you may affect things in a very, very small way, but that the UN and that approaching all 197, 93 member states is a very good way to enact social change, to apply science. So I think everyone, we may be practical, we may be realistic, but there's optimism always.
Understood. Thank you.
The room is open to other questions. Are there maybe more general questions that you'd like to ask Corann and David and me? I don't know. How they got involved in this, how they connected their work to this kind of advocacy or to human rights.
Corann, how did you get involved in the UN?
Well, I was invited to join the SPICI team at the UN as a faculty member at the university. My main areas of focus were developmental psychology, lifespan development, and Africana studies. And so when I came into the UN, the first areas I was interested in were children and adolescents. So I joined the working group on children's rights, and turned that into a non-governmental organization committee on the rights of children. I had been following issues of gender inequality, and so I became involved with the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. And then as a result of the World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa in 2001, came back into New York, and we, as with many others, established the NGO Committee for the Elimination of Racism. So on the whole, those three areas have been the areas in which my primary teaching was involved with, and it also involved the work of my advocacy. The Africana studies, people of African descent, were intersected into those three areas.
How did I get involved in the UN? I actually went to graduate school in New York and absolutely did nothing at the UN, and then moved away. And a few years later, became aware of Psychology Day at the UN. I had no idea really what kind of activities we could undertake, and actually saw a call by SPICY for more representatives. And I'm just a bus ride away from New York City. So I applied to join, went through some interviews, and thankfully was taken on. My initial interest had to do with migration and intergroup contact. But what I have found is that given the priority of climate change throughout the UN, I've been very much drawn to the area. And so that's where my interest is now. And so I've put that to good use. I'm teaching a course on sustainability and getting familiar with a lot of the literature that ties together all of the lessons that we have, say, from social psychology in service of promoting adaptive behaviors for climate change. So I went to the UN with some interest, but then I was exposed to others. I think that's one of the wonderful things about being involved, is that you have your specialty area, you have your research area, but you have the opportunity to be a generalist as well. You have the opportunity to go to a commission on all kinds of different subjects that may overlap. And I think it's a tremendous experience for folks, actually, for scientists, for anyone interested in using evidence to impact social policy. Plus, I'm closer to New York than Washington.
Thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I think I'll invite you to make closing comments. If there are any last things you want to make sure to leave people with, calls to action, next steps.
I'll give Corann the last word. Yeah, we've sent around a URL to connect to the statement. If you are interested in learning more about the UN, even if we're not your scientific discipline, we can advise and give you some directions. So contact Sarah or contact a member of SPICY's UN team. Sarah's waiting. So that's all. That's my last word. Corann?
When you read the statement, and if you like to sign on to the statement, we will be including the sign-in link later. So you could go back to the website and sign in. It's been a pleasure to share this statement with you, and we look forward to some of you becoming involved in our work, moving it forward. Thank you.
Thank you
for the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing this important work for this, and for all of the hard work you've put into this action. We'll look forward to being able to share more information about it with the members of the Science and Human Rights Coalition, and maybe discussing it, continuing